Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Crazy Money. This is your host, Paulollinger. I'm happy that you're here this week because we have a very important topic to discuss. That is student loan debt. Did you know that student loan debt is the largest form of non-mortgage debt in the United States, and that total outstanding balances, uncollateralized that is, have increased by sevenfold since 2004? Back then, it was $260 billion owed. Today, the total is $1.75 trillion. That's trillion with a trill. President Biden, for whom I voted, by the way, because the alternative was and remains a dumpster fire, is expected to forgive hundreds of billions of dollars of these loans, but with absolutely no plan for fixing the underlying problems that got us here in the first place. On this week's Crazy Money, I speak to Oren Cass. He's an incredibly intelligent human being. He is the executive director of a group of thinkers called American Compass, and he is the author of a book called The Once and Future Worker, A Vision for the Renewal of Work in America. Oren's done significant research into the topic of student loans, which he outlines in a very recent article called The Banality of Student Loans, links to which are in the show notes. And I beseech you to read this and share it with all your friends after you listen to this incredible conversation I've had with Oren, and share it with all your friends. In this conversation, Oren and I discuss why student loans are not subject to bankruptcy proceedings and the massive problems that causes, why America's College for All policy is a terrible one that does a huge disservice to the students who need an economic boost the most, who college is right for and what the alternatives should be, why the federal government should not underwrite student loans and who should. Hint, hint, here's the next one, why and how colleges and universities should take more accountability for the price and product they provide to their students. I know you're going to find this conversation interesting and enlightening. Please enjoy our chat with Oren Cass. Oren Cass, welcome to Crazy Money.
Thanks for having me.
Oren, we're going to get into the student loan issue in just a second, but before we do, tell me a little bit about who you are and the work you do at American Compass.
Yeah, sure. I guess the technical term is a policy wonk.
Way to sell yourself early, Warren.
For anyone who is still on the podcast, I study and read and write about public policy all day, but have some fairly strong opinions about what is wrong with how, frankly, both progressives and conservatives have been approaching a lot of issues, I'd say for the last 40 years or so. And so at American Compass, we work on trying really across the political spectrum, but focused especially on the right of center to try and rethink, what on earth should conservatism actually mean, and how can we think about the economy and start to create policies that are actually going to help your typical working family.
We'll talk about your book, The Once and Future Worker, toward the end of the podcast. But what's really interesting about the student loan issue is that it brings a lot of different issues together. It brings in families, it brings in education, it brings in class, and it brings in public funding of privately consumed goods. So let's talk about the facts on student loans real quick. If I have it right, there were $260 billion in student loans outstanding in 2004, where there's over $1.5 trillion today. And the average balance of a student graduating with student loans is around $29,000. Is all of this because college is too expensive?
Well, college is very expensive. Whether it's too expensive or not, I guess, is in the eye of the beholder. It has a big price tag, but we also spend a tremendous amount of money, right? Like, it's not like there are these huge college university barons who are pocketing billions of dollars. What we've done is created an extraordinarily expensive college experience. If you think about just the fancy buildings on dotting campuses, the dorms, the levels of administration. One thing that's very interesting, if you look up at where costs have risen so much in recent decades, it's not actually the professors, right? So what we're spending all the money on isn't where can we find somebody to teach kids things they need to know. It's sort of all the rest of it. And we now spend, I think, about twice as much as a European country like a France or a Germany on a college education for somebody. And I think, unfortunately, the flip side is it's not clear what we're actually getting for that money.
When you say we're spending it, how is the average taxpayer investing in his or her fellow citizens' education?
Yeah, that's a great point. There's obviously a huge amount that people are paying themselves. So whether it's the student's family, tuition costs are way up. But it's really important to remember that most students are at public universities, state U. And the price tag for that is dramatically reduced by public subsidy. So your state government is already spending a lot of money to provide what is a more affordable college degree from a state university. So there you might be paying, say, $10,000 a year of tuition rather than $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 at a private university. But then on top of that, out of that money you're supposed to pay, you might be receiving all sorts of support, so that you might be receiving direct grants. If you're borrowing money, you're benefiting from subsidies that the public provides on the money you borrow. If you saved up, you're probably benefiting from special tax treatment that let you avoid pay taxes on that money. And so all in, if you go across state, federal spending, we're spending about $250 billion a year supporting higher education with public money, which comes out to, on the order of about $10,000 per year per student who's in school.
So the taxpayers are subsidizing each individual's loans, which many of us benefit from, either ourselves or for our children. 20% of the borrowers that have borrowed money to go to college are in default on their student loans. But why, Oren? They're college graduates. Aren't they perfectly positioned for a life of self autonomy when it comes to their financial world?
Well, the first problem is they're not college graduates. A huge share of folks who enroll in higher education don't complete. And in fact, if you look at who's defaulting on student loans and who's facing the highest pressure, it's not necessarily that student who borrowed a lot of money, completed a 4-year degree, got a great job. They might have a high student loan balance, but they also have the ability to pay that. The real student loan crisis is all of the people who were pushing into higher education, who in the past we wouldn't have sent to college, who are very unlikely to succeed in college, but we tell them to borrow the money anyway. And they drop out. Maybe they only have $5,000, $10,000 of debt, but now they've wasted all that time. They've spent that money. They have nothing to show for it. And so that's really where, to the extent that we have a crisis, I would say the main crisis really lies.
So you write a lot about the college for all concept. You believe deeply that not everybody should go to college. And by saying that out loud, printing it in ink and pen or the digital equivalent, you risk being called an elitist. Why do you go to such trouble to make the point of college not being the solution for everyone?
Well, because it's true. So that's a good starting point.
Oh, come on. That's a terrible place to start.
It is true and not understood, I think, is really the sweet spot. Part of the phenomenon here that has created this college bubble is that, unsurprisingly, the folks who are policymakers typically are people who went to college. They're people who it worked out for, and they tend to hang out with other people who it worked out for. And so we have in our head this idea that, look, sure, you can find somebody who it didn't work for, but that college is a great idea and that's where everybody should be. And the reality is that if you step back and look at the data, it's actually remarkably improbable to make it successfully through our college pipeline. So, we still have a huge share of students who don't even graduate from high school, let's not forget. And we've got our graduation rates from high school up, but a lot of that seems to be just by lowering standards and giving diplomas to people who haven't really completed the work. Then we have a huge share of people who complete high school but don't even enroll in college. And, these are approximate numbers, but it's helpful to think about, roughly speaking, about 1 in 5 are still not completing a meaningful high school degree. 1 in 5 are graduating from high school but not going on to college. 1 in 5 will go on to college but then drop out of college. 1 in 5 will complete college but end up in a job that didn't even require their degree. And only about 1 in 5, actually fewer than 1 in 5 young Americans actually go high school, college, career on that pathway that we sort of figure is where we should be sending everybody.
So the college, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, look, it's a great pathway, right? if that's going to work for you.
If it works for you.
If it works for you, then that's a good pathway to be on. But the reality is that it doesn't work for most people. And so to push everyone in that direction, to push all of our resources in that direction, ends up benefiting a very small share of the population. And by the way, those who are likely to be best off economically anyway, at the expense of everybody else.
So who's in that group? Okay, let's talk frankly about who's in these groups, right? So that top quintile, the people who went to college, they finished college and they're using their degree, that would be arguably me, probably you, people who come from stable backgrounds, or maybe I'm just making that assumption. Who's in that group? Is it smart kids, people from two-parent families, people from certain geographies? Who's in that group?
Yeah, so it's all of the above. It's certainly disproportionately kids who are coming from stable, more advantaged backgrounds. Kids who have good role models, kids whose parents went to college a lot of the time. But then it's also kids who have a lot of academic aptitude. That one thing we've found that surprised us somewhat in our survey data is it's not just a sort of reproduction generation after generation. Everybody who went to college goes and have kids who go to college. You see a huge share of folks who come from, you say, oh, that's a stable two-parent household. The parents have degrees. That kid's going to be fine. Huge share of those kids aren't fine, actually. And then there are plenty of kids who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds or from stable but lower middle class backgrounds who have a lot of academic aptitude, and they can go on and be very successful. But at the end of the day, I think what it comes down to is two things. One, academic aptitude is one of many skills out there in the world. We have this unfortunate way, I think, of using the word smart to describe someone who has academic aptitude, and then someone else we say something condescending like, oh, well, he's good with his hands. Right. When the reality is that someone who's good with their hands and can actually be a successful electrician is every bit as talented, and by the way, a lot more useful, and probably going to earn a lot more money than somebody who's great at saying interesting things about Shakespeare.
Right. Yeah. No, I really like one of those people who knows a lot about Shakespeare to come and fix my my plumbing or my electrical issues at my house.
Right. And so it's important, I think, to say, look, there are kids who have a lot of academic aptitude for whom the thing that makes sense when they turn 18 or 19 is to go sit in a classroom for 4 more years. Like you said, I was one of those kids. And I went and sat and studied political economy for 4 years and read about a lot of stuff that I write about. And I'm glad that option was available to me. But it is not somehow elitist to turn around and note that is not an option available to or right for a whole lot of other people. I think it is an awful lot more egalitarian to recognize, no, wait a minute, people have very different aptitudes. By the way, people have very different desires. Another interesting kind of cliche we have in our head is you go away to college, right? You do the college tour with your parents. And even among people who go to college, most are still living at home or going to college very close to home. A huge share of them don't want to go far away. They want to stay in their communities. When we surveyed people and asked, what do you want out of the education system? Far and away, it wasn't maximize my academic achievement and get into the best college I can. It was give me the skills to build a decent life in the community where I live. And so that's what we need to, that's what we should be asking our education system to do.
But that's what's so fascinating about this issue, the way you analyze it, I think, is because you dive into some of the assumptions that we just make. And I'd love for you to talk about the assumption that success looks like optimizing your professional potential, that moving away which is, by the way, what I did. I moved to New York and Silicon Valley. And by the way, I'm back in my hometown of Atlanta 20 years later. But I moved away, I optimized my income, and that's what success looks like. And the other thing that you really talked about that was really important was this chart, the most powerful chart in politics today, which demonstrates the difference between someone who went to college and someone who didn't. Can you talk about these assumptions and how they inform policy and have driven us potentially in the wrong direction?
Yeah, sure. And I would start with that chart and actually make a modification to it, which I've only realized recently. I used to talk about that chart exactly in those terms. And I realized that, the distinction isn't so much between went to college or didn't, or, has a degree or doesn't.
And this is earning power.
Yeah, that's right. It's really a much smaller group who got a degree and got a job that required that degree. Because part of the problem, we have this idea that, the future is these kinds of jobs and the economy has all these jobs and we have to educate kids for them. And the reality is we're actually producing new college graduates about twice as fast as the economy is actually adding jobs that require college degrees. So part of that reason you have all these kids who are completing college and not finding jobs that require their degrees, it's not because they're dumb kids or bad at, job interviews or something. It's because the jobs aren't even there. Our education system and our idea of our education system is aligned neither with the reality of people's desires and aptitudes, nor with the reality of our economy. And so, when we think about success, to your second point, which I think is exactly right, I think, again, we have to entirely respect and support the person whose definition of success is to go start that company in Silicon Valley. Obviously, that's incredibly important, and we need those folks. We just have to be aware of how much our view of our culture is skewed by the fact that those are the people who create our culture. And that the stories that get written about in the newspaper, that get made into movies, that get depicted on sitcoms, that those profiles of people, absolutely there are people like that, but there are at least as many, probably a lot more people not like that. And a successful economy and ultimately a successful nation has to be one that has room for everybody.
I want to talk about the metrics that you would use to define a successful life. But first, I want to talk about any potential generational differences. And I'll use this one anecdote. I don't pretend to represent this as statistically representative data, but I see a lot of these anecdotes out there. I received a pitch from a publisher to interview the author of a book called Okay Boomer. Here's what happened. Basically, it's I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, but I read probably 50 pages of it. And I stopped at the point where the author said that the reason that boomers don't understand what her generation, the millennial generation, was going through is because they've done all this economic injustice to us. She said, I can barely afford to pay my law school debt as a freelance writer. And I'm like, okay, well, clearly you're not supposed to be paying your law school debt as a freelance writer. You're supposed to be paying your law school debt as a lawyer who went to NYU. And maybe you hate that job, but you made a commitment when you took those loans on that you're going to have to go eat crap at a white shoe law firm doing research in the library for 5 years until you buy yourself back. Is that a generational thing, or am I just imagining that because I'm an old fogey white guy?
I think there's definitely a generational element to it, which is that there is an attitude among younger people that they are supposed to sort of just be pursuing their dreams and doing what they love, and that they're entitled to have that work out. I think the flip side is we should acknowledge that is exactly what the culture created by the boomers and older guys such as yourself tells them.
I didn't say that. I didn't tell him to follow her bliss.
That when we talk about a generation, it's right to recognize that generations have these different attitudes, but it's not like there was something different in the water when these kids were gestating, right? It's the culture that they've been raised in. And so right. I think we have two problems. We both have a problem that we've built this culture that somehow suggests, that you can and should just do what you love and pursue your dreams, and that is what you're entitled to, and it is going to work out. But then in conjunction with that, we've built a culture and an economy that says really the only way to make it is to do this set of things. So you are here in high school to prepare for college, because gosh, we sure don't have anything else for you.
Yeah.
And, you're going to go to college to presumably earn some sort of degree. And then you're probably someone's going to tell you really need to go to grad school if you want to get a good job. And so, I actually have a law degree too. And I spend a lot of time talking to people who are thinking about whether or not to go to law school. And there's a lot of advice they need that I would say they're probably not getting, one of which is do not go to law school right after college. Even if you're 100% sure you want to be a lawyer, maybe, give it some time, get out there and do something else first. And then second, don't go to law school unless you know exactly why you're going to law school.
Mm-hmm.
And instead we have the message that's been sent. It's more education is just always better and has an automatic return on investment. So I, on the one hand, have very little sympathy for the freelance writer who's having trouble paying her law school debts, because obviously if you take on the law school debt, you're probably going to have to go be a lawyer to pay for it. But at the same time, I sort of recognize, she was pushed into an education system and set of options and set of messages that was just not a very good one.
Okay, and that's partly culture, but it's partly a system that removes a lot of friction from that decision because they say, here's what you should be doing. Oh, and by the way, here's a stack of money to pay for it that you're automatically approved for, regardless of what your plans are afterwards. So let's talk a little bit about why is student student debt treated differently than other kinds of debt in our economy?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and something that I think, on one hand is just like a technocratic, like how what should our policy be? But
it's hugely impactful. It's hugely impactful.
Well, it's hugely impactful and turns out to actually be, I think, really philosophical, right? Because as a starting point, it shouldn't be different. One of the strangest things about, forgiving student loans and this sort of discussion is like, well, why aren't we forgiving auto loans, right? Like, what about all those people who borrowed money to buy a car? I bet they'd love you to,
so that they can get to their job,
right.
So that they can go and do their work.
Right. And yet we have this sort of strange concept of student debt in our minds. And I think what it starts from is that by default, student debt is just a terrible idea, right? Like from everybody's perspective. I mean, if you're a young person, you probably don't necessarily know what exactly you want to do. You are sort of trying to place this big bet with an uncertain return that is going to leave you on the hook for a long period of time. It's hard to believe that that's really the smart move for somebody to take that on. And again, some people, they know exactly what they want to do. They know they're going to be good at it. Yep. They've got the test scores. They're off, and that's fine. For an awful lot of people, really sort of a speculative risk to take. And then from the perspective of the lender, why on earth would you ever lend money to an 18-year-old with no credit history, no way to validate, how they're going to behave or what they're going to do with this money? Nothing you can take back, right? At least if someone defaults on their car loan, there's a car there. If someone defaults on their education loan, you can't take back their education. And so it's really a very foolish loan to make. And so by default, in fact, not a lot of these loans would get made. And for some reason, policymakers looked at this situation and instead of concluding, gosh, we should really have an education system that's not premised on very young people going way into debt to finance something they're not sure they want or need, instead they said, no, this is exactly what we need. We should just create a set of policies to make sure everyone goes and does this, even though every party to the transaction is basically screaming, no, don't do this.
So how did that get formalized and what has that created in terms of how we solve this mess? So this has created some structural, it's sort of put us in handcuffs in ways that having a more market-based lending system would allow for mistakes to resolve themselves.
Yeah, well, so the first thing that happened was the federal government came in and just said, we'll guarantee the loans. So we want people to make loans to these students, even though they're risky loans. So please just go ahead and do it. And if they get defaulted on, we will pick up the tab. At which point, of course, a lot of everyone said, great, sure. All right,
what could possibly go wrong?
Let's start handing out the money. In conjunction with that, then the government said, wait a minute, though. Now that we're on the hook for all of this, we're worried that these students are going to go get their education and then just declare bankruptcy. And there will be nothing for us to take back. So now let's add a rule also that you can't get rid of your loans in bankruptcy. So any other kind of debt, it's a somewhat unique, actually, American principle, and I think an incredibly important one, that we say, look, we expect you to repay your debts. If you get to the point where you can't, we actually do have this mechanism called bankruptcy. And we have an incredibly lenient bankruptcy system compared to the rest of the world. And we say, could someone abuse it? Yeah, maybe. But there are a lot of costs associated with declaring bankruptcy too, right? You have to forfeit a lot of assets. Your credit goes in the tank. You have reputational costs. And so we're basically going to trust someone's only going to declare bankruptcy if they kind of need the bankruptcy relief. And that turns out to be a really great system. And then we said, except student loans. Student loans, we've decided that education is so valuable. We don't care how much it costs. We're going to back you in spending as much as you want on education. And then we're going to turn around and tell you, no matter what, you can't get out from under that ever. Like that is our brilliant way of financing education, with the added bonus that because we structured it this way, guess what colleges and universities and all the people working there did? They said, well, great, then we're just going to keep making this more expensive and hiring more people and building our little empires. And it doesn't matter because the money's just going to keep flowing. And so that's how we got into this situation. To me, the discussion now of like, well, let's just forgive student loans is exactly the wrong step. I mean, we could talk about all the technical reasons it's a terrible idea and unfair, but at the end of the day, it just doubles down on exactly what we've done wrong. It says, yes, this is this special debt that's not like other debt. And we recognize the special thing that students do that's different from other people. And we're going to give them this special dispensation. And by the way, we're going to do nothing about the underlying system. We're going to run it back again the next day.
So you could forgive 100% of student loans, and then tomorrow the clock just starts up again.
Yes. Which seems unwise. And by the way, even worse, because now on top of everything else, you've sent a message that, hey guys, when the student loan, when you guys really start getting crushed, maybe we'll just give it all back.
Right.
That's now on the table also.
Yeah, it's crazy. The number one reason, or a lot of the reasons, often you read that one of the reasons you shouldn't forgive student loans is because it's actually rewarding people who have professional degrees, who have very high balances of student loans, who I would have been in 1998. And I also went out. By the way, when I graduated from business school with $80,000 in debt, I actually wanted to be a stand-up comedian, which I eventually became. But I realized I couldn't do that because I had these obligations. So I went out and I worked, and then I paid off my loans, and I went and did comedy for full time for 2 years in Los Angeles. But the argument you hear right now is that, well, you're just rewarding the wrong people, professionally educated people who are dentists and lawyers and business school people who are going to make $300,000 in a couple of years, but have high balances. Is that the best argument for not forgiving loans?
I don't think that's the best argument. It gets to one element of the problem, certainly. But there are ways that you can address that somewhat. I mean, for one thing, you could say, well, these kinds of loans are in versus out. You could say we're only going to forgive $10,000. We're only going to forgive $50,000. I think at the end of the day, though, what you find is that any attempt at sort of tailoring this and saying like, we're going to somehow figure out who really deserves the money and just give them their money back. There's no real way to do it well. And you're left at the end of the day with the question, why these people and not other people? Why the student debtors and not the car debtors, a huge share of whom we're just trying to find a way to get to work? And so this is why I emphasize the bankruptcy point so much, which is that in any other context, we would say, look, guys, if you actually can't pay your loans and you're under so much pressure that bankruptcy is preferable, well, then declare bankruptcy. But of course, with student loans, we've said, no, no, you cannot. And so It seems to me it makes a lot more sense to just say, okay, actually, you can. Rather than try to design through policy some filter that's going to figure out who does and does not deserve and need help, and then make the help to those people totally free and costless, different than we treat everybody else in the world, why don't we just say student debt is debt, like all debt? And if you, a debtor with student loans, are in such a situation, whether if you're that business school student with the $300K and you think bankruptcy is the right next step, that should be available to you too, with all of the costs and benefits that come with it. If you're the person with $5,000 of debt and bankruptcy is the right next step, that's the step for you with all the costs and benefits. But let's let people make that choice, facing the exact same cost we always ask people in debt to look at when they make the choice. And let's actually proceed on that, what I think is much fairer basis.
Let's say you could start the lending system, student lending system from scratch today. What would it look like?
So I think you have to get the government out of this lending business altogether. And I don't say that for some sort of principled small government. Small government
conservative, Oren, that's what you are.
No, and in fact, what sort of makes the conservatism we work at on an American Compass distinctive is I would be the first to say there are a lot of places where there's a really important role for government in the economy. And I'm happy to discuss all of those. But when you look at what's going on in the education market with student loans, the idea that what we need is to sort of grease the skids and make it easier for people to take unwise loans it's just backward. It is defining the problem wrong and then coming up with the wrong solution. What I'd like to see the government do is say, look, public education is very important. For a lot of people, that means college education. For a lot of people of limited means, we don't want to cut off their access to higher education. So we already have this state university system that provides generally affordable higher education. Is it expensive? Yes. But in the median state, which is Colorado, annual tuition at a 4-year University of Colorado high quality public system, it's only $8,000 a year. So look, $8,000 is a lot of money. Is that something that someone cannot afford to pay part of with a part-time job, save some money for, pay back a few years after? It's still achievable. And so I would say, let's look at what that kind of typical public education cost is. And let's have the federal government say, we'll offer a grant that covers half of it. To anybody who needs it. That is our commitment to you. Now, if you want to go to some place that costs $50,000 a year, you're also still getting $4,000 a year.
Right, yeah.
The fact that some of these places cost a lot more, but don't actually provide a better education, that's for you, the student, and you, the college, to work out. That's not my problem as a policymaker. That's not the public's problem.
Then if the government's not guaranteeing the loans, who is guaranteeing the loan?
Right. So what's going to happen if we shift to this model? A couple of things are going to happen. One is universities are going to reduce their costs real quick, and they're going to start actually providing things that add value to people that people are willing to pay for when they see the cost of it. And then the second thing that's going to happen is that, I went on that rant a bit earlier on how ridiculous it is to try to finance student debt. There's one institution out there that actually is very sensible for them to finance student debt. They have the right incentives, they have the right information, they have control of the outcomes to some extent. And that, of course, is the colleges and universities. So just like if you go to buy a car today and you need an auto loan, that auto loan is actually typically coming from the car company because they want you to buy the car. Colleges and universities should be providing the financing to students. So if you're a fancy, expensive university and you're confident that what you are providing is actually worth that cost and that you are admitting students who are actually going to benefit from it and get something of value that is going to allow them to pay you back over time, then by all means, and lend them the money, which is,
right.
And you could structure it various ways, but essentially what you're saying is don't charge them up front. The deal will be if you want to go to an expensive school, you are agreeing to pay for that education over the following decade as you graduate and have earnings. And the school is going to understand you're probably only going to ever get that money if you actually provide something of value and put that person in a position to pay you back. And schools that do that successfully will be very successful. And schools that don't will go out of business. And that's great.
Would you price a finance program differently than you price a classics program?
If I were running a university, I mean, that's a great question and exactly the sort of thing a university would actually have to think about, right? What am I?
Because the argument is you're saying that the classic educational system, which might be argued to be dead anyway, but that has no value, or it has significantly less value. How do you answer that question?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the question is for who, to whom and for what purpose are you providing the education? So a classical liberal arts education for somebody who is, has demonstrated through their academic record, a very high ability to do that kind of work and is likely to proceed into a career that is built on that kind of work. Classical education can be exactly the right thing for that person. They're going to go on to earn a good income. And should be happy to pay what it costs to provide that education. What we can't be doing is saying, and any college that tried this would quickly find itself out of business, is saying, hey, look at this great classical education that's extremely expensive to provide. Come one, come all. Come spend your 4 years doing this, consume these resources, then go back out and, go out into the world, have no way to repay the cost of those resources. That's just not going to work. And it shouldn't fly. We shouldn't consider that an acceptable way to do business.
Mm. You wouldn't want to create a glut of associate professors for whom there's no job on the other side of graduation.
Well, that's right, and unfortunately, I think we do have such a glut today. I mean, I just described it as sort of not a way to do business. Higher education is a business, and sometimes I refer to it as Big Ed.
Big Ed sounds like a greasy used car salesman on the side of a country highway.
Well, and if you check out some of the behaviors in some of these admissions departments, that may not be such a bad description. But regardless, depending on how you measure it, the higher education industry is the largest lobbyist in Washington.
Oh wow!
And at the local level, the colleges and the community colleges, universities, as kind of local employers, as sources of pork from the state capital in Washington. This is a huge, tightly tied to government business that has created just these massive both bureaucracies of just layer after layer of assistant deputy, social dean for whatever. And then also professors who, if that's how they want to spend their lives and they can find someone to pay them, that's fine. But, I'm not sure how many scholars of comparative 13th century literature we need. And so part of the problem is that it has sort of become a self-supporting industry where higher education cranks out all of these specialized, academic, typically PhDs, for whom the only plausible form of employment is in that exact same institution teaching the next generation of people. And there just isn't a lot of economic value there. And I think, it is burdening the entire society for the benefit of a very small and elite group who don't need those resources.
Yeah. You didn't like Dead Poets Society, the movie, did you?
Well, that was a prep school, wasn't it?
I'm just kidding.
I prefer, I don't know if you've seen the SNL skit where the kid jumps up on the table and the ceiling fan immediately takes his head off. I liked that.
I think you can say both things. As you say, yes, the classics are the things we stay alive for. Art and beauty and all those things are wonderful, but you have to be able to pay your bills, and you shouldn't rely on your fellow taxpayer to subsidize your PhD in a field where you're probably not going to find employment. So,
yeah, well, that's right, and the PhD problem is also such a niche one. It's extremely annoying. And when you talk about, well, if we change what we do, like what will happen to all these associate professors, that's when you kind of have to say, yeah, that's going to be rough for a lot of associate professors. The much bigger problem is the, millions of people for whom these sorts of pathways are not appropriate. We've talked about all the money, and a lot of cases, it's actually the time. It's the opportunity cost of these years that they spend. And then the last thing that I always really want to emphasize, and this will be pretty policy wonkish of me, is that in a sense, the biggest problem is that we're not offering anything else. Like if we, right. What I ultimately would like to see us do is take about half of what we spend subsidizing higher education today, so, 125 billion a year, say, actually, we're going to spend that on non-college pathways. We're going to spend that on subsidizing entry-level employment, on providing great training, on the additional cost of good vocational programs in high schools. And we're actually going to build a pathway that says, look, you can get to age 20 with on-the-job experience, savings in the bank, no debt, an industry credential, and a job.
Which is actually more like the norm in other countries, other Western countries, correct?
Yes, it is. It is very much norm around the world. And, it's funny, there's a wonderful chart I always like to show people of sort of all the developed economies, what share of their high school students are in some sort of career technical vocational program. And it's sort of, 35 to 55%, generally speaking. So a third to a half of students are in these kinds of programs. And then every country is there except the US. And there's a little footnote that says we've had to exclude the US from this chart because the US system is too different.
Because we're so good? Because we're the best?
Yeah, right. America. It's like, well, no, but you could have put America on the chart. It just would have been at 0. or, or
Right.
maybe at
Yeah,
2%, depending on how you want to measure it. And so, let's do that. And let's say, look, here are these two pathways that are now available. And if everybody still wants to charge down the college pathway, this is America, and that's going to be open to them as an option, though they'll bear more of the cost themselves. But I got to tell you, if those are the two pathways available, I'm pretty sure a pretty big share would prefer the non-college pathway. And I say that in part because we've surveyed thousands of American young adults and parents of young adults and asked them, which would you have preferred was available for you or your kid at the end of high school? 4-year full ride to any college you could get into, or 3-year paid apprenticeship leading to a good job. And most people choose, both the kids and the parents choose apprenticeship leading to a job. Among those who didn't complete college, of course, it's massive preference for the apprenticeship. And one thing that I find really interesting is kids who completed college, for the most part, unsurprisingly, will say, I wish someone had paid for my college.
Right.
But among parents whose kids have successfully completed college, more than 40% of them still said, I would have preferred my kid had access to a 3-year apprenticeship that led to a good job. And I think that speaks to the extent to which, really everyone across our system sees, yes, there are kids that the college works for, and that's fine. No one's suggesting we shutter all the colleges. But everybody now knows people, whether it's their own kids, friends from high school, siblings, for whom this is just not a good system. And I think the appetite for our obligation to offer an alternative and the appetite for that alternative is just enormous.
This seems like a good place to pivot to the once and future worker, because it seems that what you just described is the difference between what people want, how they define success and happiness, and what the system is telling them that they should want, or what the system is telling them is available. Why'd you write The Once and Future Worker, and how do these things relate to the thesis of the book?
So the thesis of The Once and Future Worker is that at the end of the day, what's most important to how we analyze our economy and think about economics, but then also how we think about our own lives is really production more so than consumption.
What do you mean by that?
And so, those are wonky, abstract terms. But if you think about our culture and, in fact, our, politicians and our economists, everyone focuses on consumption. How much cheap stuff do we have to consume? In fact, in formal economic terms, the goal is to consume as much stuff as possible while doing as little work as possible, right? So if you could snap your fingers and nobody had to work anymore, and one person made all the stuff and we could all just have as much of anything we wanted, that would be the most prosperous society.
Theoretically.
And yet I think anyone who sort of has any experience in the actual world knows that that's just not true. Either thinking about what a society needs or what we need in our own lives, look, consumption is actually, is important. I like stuff. I'm not one of these, live in a cabin in the woods guys. But at least as important is our role as producers, is our ability to feel like we are needed, that we do something that is useful to other people, that we sort of earn our keep, support ourselves, can support our families. And all of that comes down to, sometimes it's not in the formal economy. So, a homemaker who's working just as hard, raising kids, doing things in the community, that can be exactly as valuable a role. But at the end of the day, when we're evaluating our own well-being and when we're evaluating what we want the economy to do and asking, is the economy working well, is we want that set of opportunities. And so the premise of the book is to say, what if we evaluated how everything's going, not by how much stuff we can consume, but by whether our economy is actually creating the opportunities for everybody, whatever their aptitudes are, wherever in the country they live, to actually find that work that's going to allow them to be a productive contributor, support themselves and their family. Well, I was just going to say, and on the one hand, that sort of can sound like simple or obvious or kind of American pie, but it actually turns out to be a dramatic shift from the way policymakers and economists think, and have a ton of implications for what we should be doing differently in the country.
And education is a perfect example of that. What are some other ones that you can touch on over the next couple of minutes?
Yeah, sure. So, a big one I think is globalization and trade and immigration and how we think about America's role in the world. All of the theory behind free trade and we should let China into the global system and trade with them as much as we can. All of the theory that says this is going to make everyone better off is purely a consumption analysis. And at least in the short run, as a consumption analysis, it's correct. The more free trade you have, the more places, the more cheap stuff you're going to have access to. As an analysis of what is actually going to put our economy and our nation on a trajectory to ensure that everybody can find a good job, it's woefully inadequate. And so, I think trade's a good thing. I think we should trade with the world, but we should make sure we're doing it on terms that preserve the things that matter most to us. And I'd say that's certainly something we haven't done. And then one more example that I like to emphasize is the idea of unions and organized labor. And I have huge issues with the way that unions operate today. But the idea of organized labor, the idea of workers sort of joining together in solidarity to pursue their common interests, to sort of assert their power versus employers, I think is an extremely important and positive one. I think as we've lost that in recent decades, as unions have sort of faded away, yes, that meant companies could be more efficient and make more cheap stuff. But what we lost, partly for workers in their experience on the job and the kind of jobs available, but also just in communities, I think was enormous. And so that's another example of a place where in none of these cases, we should just go back to, the 1950s or whatever. That's not going to solve any of these problems. But in thinking about what we should be aiming for, the sort of idea of we'll just be this sort of, open, free, globalized society of people enjoying really big TVs is just something I really think we have to get away from.
And I believe these are your words, but the working hypothesis in the book is described. It says that a labor market in which workers can support strong families and communities is the central determinant of long-term prosperity and should be the central focus of public policy. That's pretty important, and it's a philosophical tenet that if you don't believe that work is important, you're going to make very different decisions that if you believe that work is an important thing for the fulfillment of an individual and for the sustenance of families, and that families are the cornerstone of our society.
Yeah, that's very well put. And I think it speaks also to sort of the crossroads that we're at. I think we can all sort of litigate what has gone wrong in recent decades in America. But I think there's a fairly widespread consensus that there are real problems in America today and for the typical American family and in the shape of the American economy. And so in my mind, a lot of the question is, well, where do we go from here? And it seems to me there are basically two options. One is to focus on this idea of the working hypothesis and say what's actually going to generate long-term prosperity for us, even if it has some short-term cost, is focusing on building an economy that reintegrates everybody as a valued, productive contributor and every community in every part of the country. The other option, which you hear promoted, it's somewhat strange actually that this is the one preferred in many cases by progressives, is essentially to ask the question, well, where do I send the check? Right? That we have people who are prospering. If you're just measuring GDP of the economy, we are richer than ever. You have all these people who are prospering under the existing system, and they don't want to hear about any of these trade-offs that would actually mean curtailing their own choices or affecting their well-being. But they're very happy to write a check, pay more taxes, support bigger safety net programs. And you see sort of the end point of that is so-called universal basic income. And this idea that we can sort of address a lot of what's wrong if we just take all of this incredible wealth generated at the top and just spread it around. And if everybody was receiving enough money to live on, then surely that would be the first step in solving our problems. And in my mind, and I think the working hypothesis speaks to this, that's just exactly wrong. That for one thing, it does not solve our problems. It doesn't address what is actually causing our problems. But as importantly, it actually makes things worse. That part of what's so important about work and that role as a contributing member of society is the idea that it's necessary, that you do your job for most people is not their favorite part of their day, but it has value and meaning because it is the means by which they provide for themselves and their family. And if you say on behalf of the government, actually, guys, we've got this. the money's already coming in, but now we hope you will still go out and work. You've actually managed, you've almost imposed a tax, not on the monetary value of the paycheck, but of all the social value and rewards that come with actually getting a job, doing something productive, and supporting those to whom you owe support. And so I think we just have to recognize that economics isn't just about making sure everybody has enough money. It's about making sure everybody has a place in the nation. And yes, that's a lot harder, but that there's no substitute for it.
But that's one that actually is humanity focused. I mean, that's one that puts value on the individual and their family and their communities. It is, I mean, I suppose you could call it compassionate conservatism. When you talk about families, you risk being lumped in with the moral majority or whatever the modern equivalent is, right? But it really is a humanity first thing. You want to give people the dignity of work, not the sustenance of a check.
And I think we have to be comfortable talking about family in exactly those terms, and because there is a morality to family, and family also, at the end of the day, is the irreplaceable asset that, and when you talked about the sort of the working hypothesis, there's that focus on long-term prosperity. It's one thing to say we can maximize what we consume tomorrow, but the only way we actually maximize our long-term prosperity is if we create an environment where families are able to raise kids who are then able to become the next generation and build upon what they inherit collectively. And work turns out to be incredibly important to that too. Having well-paying jobs, especially for men, is an incredibly important predictor of marriages and family formation in the first place. Having that kind of work is incredibly important to family stability. Unemployment as a predictor of divorce is an extraordinarily tight connection. And then being raised in a family where the parents are working and productive contributors and modeling that is incredibly important to outcomes for kids as well. And so this again is where, I describe the model of the one person producing everything and everyone else just gets a check. Look, I don't think that's actually going to make individuals all that happy. But for me, the much bigger concern is I don't think there's any chance you actually sustain a society and a culture that encourages and rewards and supports people building families and doing the work of raising the next generation, if that's your economic framework. I think you have to have one, you have to have a culture and an economy built around the idea that that the family unit is what generates prosperity in the long run. And therefore, we need an economy that allows and encourages people to form those family units, maintains the economic logic of a family unit as something that can support itself, and then positions young people as they come up through those families to take on the burdens themselves.
Well, Oren, your writings made me think a lot about big problems and the opportunities we have to address them. Where can our listeners and viewers find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, sure. Please check us out at americancompass.org. You'll find all of our more theoretical thinking and then many, many wonky white papers as well.
Orencass, thanks for your time.
Thank you. This was great.
Hey, everybody, if you like what we're up to here at Crazy Money, do us and yourself a favor by following the show on your favorite podcast app and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Also, click the link in the show notes to subscribe to my new Substack, where you'll get bi-weekly thoughts on the role of money in our world and in our lives directly to your email inbox. Thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next week.